There has been a lot of online discourse, mostly from people not in my generation, that is Generation X, but in the generations that came up after us, the millennials and Gen Z, about gifted and talented programs, classifications, usually along the lines of a trope of these kids were told that they were something special and it screwed them up for life because now look at, they're underachieving and the neuroses and anxiety and pick whatever else you want to throw in there. And I had a very, very different experience, and it could be because I grew up as a kid in the 1970s and 1980s. It also could be because I grew up in pretty rural area, at least for elementary school, which I'll tell you about in just a moment. And it also could be because there really wasn't as much pressure that people placed upon us, or I guess our parents and our parents upon us, as it seems like younger people who got labeled as gifted wound up with. So I grew up, after we moved from Madison when I was a really little kid, where my dad was finishing up law school after he had gotten his accounting degree and was already a CPA. He went on at University of Wisconsin-Madison, got his law degree. We moved out to this area of Milwaukee where he was actually working for Touche Ross, and we lived in Thiensville for a short time. And I do remember a little bit of going to a school there, which I guess was a Montessori school, but all I remember was talking about dinosaurs with other kids. And then we moved out to what's effectively the border of the village of Wales and the township of Delafield. And back then, it was very, very rural. Wales had been around for quite a long time. That's where I went to elementary school and actually kindergarten as well. And, Wales has grown a little bit since then, but not much. Delafield was a tiny little town that now has exploded because all these people have moved out of the Milwaukee area out there so they could buy real estate and all of that. So we moved into this subdivision where we were the third family to move in. It was the middle of the 1970s, and the lots weren't selling very well. There was kind of an economic recession going on. So, there wasn't a great tax base either. And I went to kindergarten, and in kindergarten I was tested the way all of us were with these kind of standardized tests, and that happened, again and again at other times. And as it turned out, I was very smart, but I also, got along more or less with the other kids and grew up, like I said, out in the countryside. We were allowed to free range quite a bit. There weren't a lot of other kids to play with. You got to know everybody in your class. And then from kindergarten, Brandybrook Kindergarten, I went to Wales Elementary. And Wales Elementary at that time was literally a 4-room schoolhouse. It's long since been closed and then turned into administrative offices. And, we would ride the bus to get there. Sometimes our parents would have to drop us off. And there was no gymnasium. Gym class was go outside and play in the parking lot, And we'd do various games. We had art class. Art class was get out your watercolors or your pencils and sit at your desk and do that kind of stuff. We had music of some sort. I don't remember an awful lot from that. But, we had the other things, reading, writing, mathematics, social studies, science of some sort. And, it was pretty rudimentary. We actually ate our lunches at our desk. Either you brought a bag lunch or you got a lunch that came from the local high school and they brought it over for us, and everybody would sit at their desk because there wasn't any cafeteria. That's all there was. And there were 4 teachers there, maybe a secretary, maybe somebody in charge. I can't even really remember that. And we didn't know any different from that. And there were a number of kids in our class who were quite smart and got identified as gifted and talented, which was the term that they used at that time. Now, what that meant, practically speaking, was we would meet once a month with either Miss or Mrs. Bailey. And I remember she had this rundown car that was sort of what they used to back then call a compact or a subcompact. You know, there was the oil crisis, so people were buying much smaller cars like Chevettes and things like that. And she would roll up, and we could like look out the windows and see her car pulling into the parking lot. She would roll up, and then there were like 4 or 5 of us. There were 2 first grade classes and then 2 second grade classes. When we moved up, we were the big class. And there were about 5 of us. I only remember 1 girl from the class, but I think also my friend Keith was probably another gifted and talented kid. And we would see Mrs. Bailey once a month for one day. She would roll up, and then we would go down into the basement. And usually you didn't go down there, but that was the only space that they had available for us. And she would like bring puzzles along. And I can look at these in my mind now and recognize she was trying to teach us some, spatial matters and mathematics. And she had the cool little blocks that you could use for like addition and multiplication. And she'd also have us like do science experiments, which always failed because there was no oversight at all once she left. And anyway, it was like, like a treat. We'd get to do these cool things that were just for us and not for the other kids. The main thing I remember about Mrs. Bailey was she had a weird smell to her, I think because of her sweat. And she was kind of soft-spoken and mousy. And that was it. That was the gifted, talented program. That's all that we had at Wales Elementary, first and second grade. There was one other thing that I should mention. So I grew up with my mother as a stay-at-home mom who worked occasionally on the weekends, and she taught me how to read, and I was reading by the time I was 3. And we had a World Book Encyclopedia, so I'd read my way through that and read other things as well. I was very gifted in that sense. And my dad could tell that I was mathematically inclined as well. So by the time that I was 4, he was teaching me arithmetic, and there was a treat. So he was a tax attorney, which is sort of like take a lawyer and an accountant and glom them together. And so he had an adding machine and he had a calculator. And a calculator was something very brand new in 1974 when he began teaching me mathematics. So the treat for me was he would give me problems to work on after he explained how to do things. And I could pick them up pretty quickly. And then I got to check my work with the calculator. And I thought the calculator was so incredibly cool. So I was all in on that. And so I made some really good progress. And, I got to know a lot of what we would do in social studies and science by reading the World Book Encyclopedia. So anyway, first grade in mathematics, we were about, 3 or 4 months in, because I remember it was winter. And the teacher gave us what was supposed to be a trick question that we wouldn't have a proper answer to. And she said something like, okay, you know what 5 minus 3 is. What is 3 minus 5? And the answer was supposed to be, well, we don't have that. We can't do that sort of thing. And I raised my hand and I was like, -2. And I saw her eyes go big, and then suddenly she left the room and came in with another teacher. And the other teacher took me aside, and they found a little cubicle over on the side for me, and they got out a fourth grade math book, and she plopped me down there, and she said, okay, you just read this book and do the problems in the book. I'll come and check on you from time to time, but you're not doing regular math anymore. That was it. That was what counted as whatever you want to say. Honors, gifted and talented, advanced placement. It was, you go off over there and you're going to do your own thing, and it's going to be more or less self-guided because we don't have resources to watch you or work with you. You're going to, figure this sort of stuff out on your own. And I was like, okay. I mean, it was challenging, but not that challenging. And I just, did what I was told, right? So anyway, fast forward a couple years, they built the big Wales Elementary just down the road from there, a new school that was much, much larger, bringing together kids from not only the old Wales Elementary, but also Cushing and Dousman and these other places around. It was serving the whole school district. And then, you had in third grade and fourth grade and fifth grade, you had these different classes that you would actually go off to. You had teachers who didn't just teach all the subjects to you as your class, but you had a math teacher, and you had a English teacher, and you had a social studies teacher, and of course a gym teacher who just, did gym, an art teacher. Actually, I'll tell you one of the really cool things about the art thing there was, and I don't remember the art teacher's name. She was a really cool lady, and she had us doing all the typical things that kids do, the Mr. Sketch markers that you could smell. They smelled like mint or mango and all that. We loved those. Or doing paper mache things, or making masks, or braiding, belts to wear, and all that kind of stuff. But as we worked, she would read to us, and for an entire, not the whole year, but a good part of it, she read us all the way through The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I thought that was so cool, But anyway, coming back to academic classes. So there were a number of us that were, and a lot of us were those kids from the gifted, talented thing, Keith Sikora, Kristen something or other, Rich Belmont, a couple other of us kids. They started taking us out of our normal classes, and this began, I want to say, in fourth grade mostly. So fourth and fifth grade, I didn't go to English class because I was reading at a high level already, and they were like, you're not going to read these books that the other kids are, or if you are, you'll come back and give a book report, on whatever you want. You just go to the library, which was kind of centrally located, and you read whatever you like. They'll let you check out any books that you want to. So, I was reading all of C.S. Lewis's stuff in the Narnia series, and there were a bunch of other sci-fi things I was reading, and, just going around and picking up books that look cool. And we were supposed to do projects of different sorts. So, they gave us a tape recorder and some cassette tapes, and me and Rich Belmont made a radio show of sorts. I remember we also were, as a side project, learning German. We didn't make it very far because we didn't have a teacher, right? But we found some books that were Teach Yourself German, and we worked our way through some of the stuff, totally without supervision at all. Except for a teacher occasionally looking to make sure we weren't getting in any trouble, and that was it. Our science classes, they took a bunch of us kids and gave us the first year it was just an electrical set. They gave us this thing that I guess you could buy at Radio Shack or other places like that. And it was like, teach yourself electronics, learn about circuits and the different kinds of things, like what does a capacitor do, or, a rheostat, what we often call a dimmer. And we would have to do projects and set them up. And, some of the time we kind of screwed off and played around, and some of the time we actually did things. In 5th grade, they gave us a chemistry set and said, you go ahead and do some chemical experiments. Here's the book, right? And again, was anybody actually checking on us? No. They would just let us do our thing. So long as there weren't any explosions or somebody getting zapped. I mean, we got shocked because we'd screw around with the 9-volt batteries on our tongs, or we'd make sparks with the dry cell batteries and stuff like that. So for science class, for the English class, a lot of the math classes, we just weren't in class. They had us just doing whatever we were doing. And I frankly don't remember a lot of it because it was totally unstructured. We would join the rest of the kids for art and music and gym and social studies, and of course for lunch and recess. But the rest of the time we're kind of on our own. And I think that my parents were not particularly impressed with that. And what ended up happening is I left the public school system after 5th grade because what was going to happen was they were going to move me directly into 7th grade. Now, I knew some of the 7th grade kids, and I was like, oh man, that's going to suck. It's a very rough school system. I'm probably going to get my butt kicked every day by these much bigger kids. And there were a lot of drugs being used in the middle school and high school at that time in Kettle Moraine School District. So I was not, super looking forward to that. But they took me there, and I remember sitting with these other kids, these 7th grade kids, and I was still in 5th grade, and they were having us take a standardized test. And I was blowing my way through it. And they were like, yeah, your kid can't go into 6th grade. What my parents ended up doing was sending me to a local private school where I qualified for a scholarship. I probably couldn't have gone, nor could my 2 friends that I made there that year have gone, John Owens and Stephen Utzereth. They were also there on scholarship. Steve Utzereth and John Owens' parents were both college professors. I don't know where Owens' parents taught, but Utzereth's parents taught at Marquette University. And so we were all, the smart kids. And this is the kind of school, it was basically a place to isolate the very rich apart from the other kids. And we were there to bring the test scores up. But I did get a pretty good education in some respects there. We had Latin 6th and 7th grade. Our soccer coach and gym teacher was a former Olympian, So they had the money to hire people, at least some of them, who were quite good at what they did. We had Ms. Beekadale. We had drama every year, and we put on plays. She actually, I've talked about this in another Sadler's Stories. She actually, my dad found me writing a play. He gave it to her. We put it on my 6th grade fall semester, which was really quite cool. And, you were encouraged to develop yourself academically. They had a good music program, good art program, all that kind of stuff. But, when you're not a rich kid, and we were solidly middle class at the time. This is before my dad died, in between 6th and 7th grade. And then we went back to basically being working class. If you're not upper class like those other kids, you can't really participate in the social life there. And it's a bit tougher, we'll just say. But, I got a decent education, And, I'd always, the way that I qualified for these scholarships was by taking these standardized tests. And I, score very highly on them because I was gifted and talented. And that was what allowed me to go to University Lake School. Then transitioning to high school, we decided that we weren't doing that sort of stuff. I was, again, quite advanced, so they put me into, I'd already had Algebra 1, so they put me into geometry with the sophomores and honors geometry, and I was in, honors classes for science and for English, social studies, and I did all the other stuff. Gym, actually, gym was my favorite class back then because I was starting to you could say decline. I was very smart, so I could get by, and I didn't have to work as hard as a lot of the other kids who sometimes got quite angry with me because they would see me sleeping or screwing off and still getting good grades when they had to work very hard for theirs. But I kind of didn't care, and I had no intention of going to college. I was planning on, getting out of school, going into the military, maybe being a lifer, maybe being a mercenary. There's a whole story there that I could tell you about. I was one of those kids that they called back then a burnout. Other people, freak was a common term that wasn't used in my school, but if you've ever seen Freaks and Geeks, that's the kind of kids that we called burnouts. And many of them were quite smart, but there was no talk of us being gifted or talented. I didn't join the academic decathlon team or the mathletes or any of those sorts of things because that wouldn't have been cool, And frankly, I was more interested in martial arts and exercise and, being involved in relationships with girls and partying and, heavy metal and that kind of stuff. And writing poetry, to be sure, and miniature wargaming and that kind of thing, So I didn't even take the PSAT. My mother was super mad at the school because turns out so it's the practice SAT. Well, you take that in high school, and if you score high enough, all these schools will line up to give you scholarships. And, she didn't even know that I wasn't taking it until after there was a newsletter from the school, and then she came in and she said, why did you allow this kid to not take it? And they were like, it was his choice, I had no reason to think I should take the SAT. I actually did end up taking the SAT in the military because they wanted to make me an officer. But I got in trouble for fighting in the barracks, and that was the end of that program. That's a whole other story as well. So long story short, I was technically gifted and talented. That didn't really mean that much back then. You didn't get special treatment or looked at as like, oh, you're the future or anything like that. It was more like, what are we going to do with this kid? He's too smart for the classes that we're teaching here. Let's put him off in the corner, have him do his own thing. Hopefully makes a couple friends that are equally gifted and talented. But there was like no structure at all. And, I found things that interested me and occasionally challenged me, but I kind of fell through a lot of cracks. And was I better off doing so? Not thinking of myself as somebody who had to fix the world or be super productive or anything like that? Yeah, probably so. I'm willing to bet that the adults now who say, oh, they screwed me over by making me gifted and talented, there's probably something to that, but there's probably also a bit of using it as, a convenient excuse for issues that you should be sorting out by this time. Point is, for me, that wasn't quite as big of a problem. The things that really hung me up were trying to fit in as a smart kid in a rich school where there was a lot of bullying and the elites they knew that they were destined for greatness and the rest of us weren't. My dad dying, Maybe falling in with the wrong kind of crowd, although I liked all those people quite a bit. Those were the big challenges for me, I would say. But, we all got our, as they say, crosses to bear. And in any case, I thought that it might be a little interesting for you to hear about my own experience with being a gifted and talented kid for what that was worth at the time.